G'day there, ladies and ladies. Welcome back to another episode of Why I Hate the Pokedex. Now we have looked at some of the poor design choices in the world of Pokemon, I think it's time to look at what kind of information it provides. Show it to good, outweigh the bad, right? How much worse could it be? Well, let's go over each piece of information the Pokedex give us, and see what we think. In no particular order, we get the Pokemon locations found, cry, height, and weight, and Pokedex description. You might get a Pokedex here and there that has different ways to communicate this info, such as a day and night slider for finding its location, or a visual indicator of its size. So let's start off with the Pokemon Cry. The Pokemon Cry is pretty basic, I guess, but it would be nice to know what kind of mood the Pokemon is in. If you think about it out loud, animals have different sounds depending on their mood and circumstances. Your pet may make different sounds when it's asking for food, to when it wants to protect you or cuddle by your side. There are also mating seasons, sickness sounds, or maybe they have their own unique sound that sounds nothing like they are told to make. It makes sense that this would apply to Pokemon as well. At the very least, they probably sound different when defending or attracting a mate. It doesn't exactly make sense to have one recording of Pokemon sound. It is a nice addition, but if we could get even just a one-word adjective of how Pokemon is feeling when making the cry on the Pokedex, that'd be great. It's fun for the game where you encounter a lot of the same Pokemon, but in terms of world building or realism, it falls flat. Every Pokemon of the same species sounding the same way at all times would be very confusing. At least when the Pokemon Fate is on low HP, it sounds a bit slower. I'm just saying that it would be nice to have more variety. Location is next. Sure, it's nice to see where Pokemon are reported being sighted, but it removes a lot of the variables that make nature interesting. Very rarely, for example, will there be fully evolved Pokemon with their unevolved versions. Are you saying that all Stoutlanders drop off their Lillipup elsewhere? Are there any families in the world of Pokemon? What about a full food chain? There's definitely places where there's an imbalance of predator Pokemon to keep a balance of Pokemon. Without this balance, there would be either ecosystem collapses or an abundance of a Pokemon, like an invasive species. I appreciate the lore having a lot of Rattatas invasive species, but without having the majority of the Pokedex on every route, there's bound to be a few places that are imbalanced. It's somewhat a miracle that ecosystems have managed to survive, let alone somehow coexist with humans. There's also no migrating species or hibernation. Maybe you know that there's seasonal variation of encounters, but if we're talking world building, then you know there's the only place that have seasons, which is weird. I just think it'd be cool to have some Pokemon unavailable at certain times, or from story progression maybe. Add more variability and a sense of hunting them down rather than just having a locator tell you where they prefer to live. I might cover this more next time, but I think that's a good spot to move on. When I was young, and I saw the height and weight of a Pokemon for the first time, I thought it was cool that they invented a vague number system to show their creatures. The numbers were so mysterious that it helped me get drawn into the fantasy of another world. But then I realised that they weren't mysterious numbers. They were using the Imperial system. Yeah, apparently there is some nuance of this. Certain countries may get metric and others get Imperial, but looking at this map, only these countries that are using Imperial should have Imperial. It just doesn't make sense that places like Australia get a version of Imperial numbers. Now, I get appealing to minority countries, it really helps to boost the worldwide aspect of it, but it doesn't make sense for the world to use the same system as Myanmar, Liberia, and North America. Sorry if I have mispronounced them. I get that the people in the Pokemon world are not the brightest, in which case, if an inferior measurement system is implemented on purpose, then that is actually decent world building. But why can't we have it similar to the unknown glyphs? Mysterious symbols that can't be translated. Like, can anyone understand this? It's a mystery. Lastly for today, we are talking about the Pokedex descriptions. This is the part of the Pokedex that most people actually care about. These give you a look at how the Pokemon functions and anything particularly interesting about it. Unfortunately, it's not good. The Pokedex is usually hyperfixated on one aspect of a Pokemon. It's cool with different versions having different data, but would it really hurt to have a bigger page with all this info? Ideally, we learn everything about this Pokemon, what it eats, any predators, favourite weather, how its body functions, but we don't get much. Take Wishy-Washy for example. The only kind of information we get is how it's weak when alone, but strong when with others. We don't get anything in terms of what it likes to actually do. That's not combat focused. We don't get much info. Now, partly this is because it's a newer Pokemon, but even older Pokemon don't get fully fleshed out. Pokedex entries get recycled, limiting new information, and fundamentally, if we need 10 generations to learn about a Pokemon, then a lot of your favourites would take forever to learn about. Imagine waiting for a new generation just to be told a different sentence of what you already knew. It would be great to have a full dedicated page of each Pokemon, or at least each family of Pokemon, rather than 4 recycled lines of text. Then of course, there are the mean Pokemon. Tell me if you've heard this before. Wailord, that has such a low density that it rises. That is more of its height and weight, but I figured he would be good to talk about it. How about how Magcargo is hotter than the sun? Electrobite can supercharge an entire city? Or how Gardevoir can create black holes? Now look, this kind of information I don't think we can really accept. From this series of videos, it's clear that there isn't any kind of scientific thinking. And with the entire curriculum in the Pokemon world consisting of type matchups and berries, I think asking a child to reasonably fill in the Pokedex is asking for trouble. Some of this stuff would be cool if intended, but since there are so many issues with the Pokedex, as I have discussed, it's not hard to question the validity of these data entries. We don't really know who or what writes data entry in the Pokedex. It could be a child, professor, which isn't much better, an AI program, or maybe a Pokemon. If an Alakazam wrote the entries, for example, it would make sense to create licenses to have trainers from catching Pokemon. It may not be the most possible outcome, but at least it makes sense. AI program randomly spreading out words and numbers could also be the cause. At the very least, I can say that no scientist or data expert has put in the info. And so, whatever the Pokedex raise in the game is ultimately null and void, as it's likely some uncalculated nonsense. Overall, the information gained by the Pokedex does not inspire confidence. A non-unified measurement system, carbon copy cries from mysterious creatures, a lack of dynamism in natural environments, and at best, a small amount of random recycled garbage information. It doesn't make for an exciting world. Based off the Pokedex, I don't care about the world of Pokemon, which is a really bad thing for arguably the main reason for the protagonist to explore the world. Maybe hate isn't the correct word. Maybe disappointment or a lack of care is a better way to describe how I feel about the Pokedex. The Pokedex could have easily have been the best parts about the games. But the Pokedex kind of feels like it's the least important part of the games. An obligation or a task rather than a delight or a passion project. But in any case, I feel I can cover everything else in another video. Until then,